I have become very sure that boundaries are one of the most mistaught and therefore misused tools in the marriage help industry as a whole. And really, I can remember the first time that this started to become clear to me that there was a deeper issue around how boundaries were handled in relationships when I had a client come to me a few years ago telling me about a book about boundaries that his wife had been reading. This was a very popular book by a very popular author, a Christian author, in fact. And I'm not going to name that book here. I'll maybe do that another time. But what ended up happening is that his wife read this book before she asked for separation. And then she used the exact language and the exact sort of posture towards the marriage as was found in this book. And he knew this because he got a copy for himself and he sent me a copy as well. And just as an aside, this exact same book, I've actually since then had multiple clients come to me and say, yeah, my wife read this book right before she asked for divorce. And so I'll tell you what the book was maybe another time when I'm in the mood to do more of a targeted critique. But for now, I really just want to talk about this topic of boundaries as a whole, because I've seen this same thing happen, although I've seen it happen multiple times with this one particular book. I've seen the same thing happen other times where it's like, oh, here's this TikToker or this YouTuber, or like there's, a gazillion different authors out there who sort of all take different approaches, but kind of arrive at the same problems when it comes to boundaries. And for this particular client, it was very frustrating because I remember that he would make meaningful headway in the separation. He would find some reconnection with his wife, but then she would go back and talk to a friend, somebody that she'd read this book with, and she would go back to this book, and then those same scripts would come back out, and she would say things like, your reality is not my reality, you just don't understand. You're just an unsafe person. And even though he disclosed to me the things in his marriage, so again, granted, I always have only a one-sided perspective. So I grant some fairness to the wife. I'm not trying to condemn this particular wife too harshly. Just saying what I've observed, which is I think I had a pretty good idea of what the boundaries were perceived as being needed for in the marriage. And yet the wife took the need for those boundaries and applied them across him as a person. And it became to where she really legitimately viewed him as unsafe to the point where this bled into their custody. This bled into their finances. And she took full license to bleed him dry financially and to take every ounce of custody that she probably could from him and to really drag him over the coals and to try every trick in the book underhanded against him to really destroy his life through the course of this divorce. And all because, from her perspective, he deserved it because she'd put these boundaries in place. And as soon as those boundaries were there, they protected her and they gave her license from ever feeling guilt about the way that she treated him. And actually, in fact, she owed it to herself to get everything that she could out of him because he'd mistreated her for so long. That was what she got to. And for my client, this was very confusing because on the one hand, he was very frustrated. He was like, I can't believe that I'm this bad of a person to warrant this level of cruelty. And yet when you hear this and you're told this over and over and over again, you start to believe it. And you start to just, in your search for trying to make sense of this terrible stuff that's happening to you, you ask yourself, maybe it is me. Maybe it is me. Maybe I am just defective as a person. And my wife is treating me this way because I'm just blind to how bad I actually am. And so this was very damaging for their relationship. It was very damaging for him. I think it was damaging for her as well. I'm quite sure it was damaging for their kids. And all of it, again, I'm not laying the blame on the author necessarily. People are responsible for how they use the information that they learn. I've read that same book. I know the author was nuanced. I know the author wouldn't probably even advise the wife to act the way that she did. And yet the wife was still able to hear this boundaries teaching and apply it in this really obtuse, heavy-handed way to her relationship. And the book, from her perception, told her to do it. Told her how to do it, told her why to do it, told her why she shouldn't recant, why she shouldn't repent, why she shouldn't relent, all because it's what he deserved. Now, I said this was going to be the boundaries episode. That's what I said at the end of the last one. But as I was recording this, and honestly, guys, this is my second time trying to record this episode, I realized there's just too much to go through for one episode. So what I'm actually going to do is, in this episode, I want to just lay the groundwork of why I think boundaries are so confusing and what specifically gets mistaught about boundaries and why that gives license and room for people to take this, I think, well intended teaching that is probably more careful than it gets applied as. And yet we get into these really messy situations where boundaries become unfalsifiable, emotional, punitive, and everything else that really destroys a marriage. And this is really going to be the end of my critique on boundaries is going to be they are used as a stepping stone towards divorce, not as a stepping stone towards relationship repair. And I think that you're going to agree with me by the time that we get to the end of this episode. But what are we even doing here? Well, this is the Husband Help Podcast. It's where you're going to learn how to be the best man, father, husband that you can be no matter what your marriage is like right now. But honestly, I probably could have called this one the Marriage Help Podcast because this is going to be a fairly generic topic. And I do think, and I've tried to consider how to make sure that what I'm about to talk about in this episode could actually be heard by your wife if you're a separated guy listening to this and apply to her, work for her, give her something that maybe she could even use in separation. And maybe this would actually be good for both of you. Now, again, I'm not saying go give your wife this episode or anything like that. I'm just saying if you are a wife listening to this, don't tune out just yet because I am going to approach this in a way that makes sense for both of you. I always here try to be fairly charitable where I can. I've seen sort of the worst ends of both genders. Okay, so I've seen the lowest of both sides of these situations. And please, although again you heard in my intro, I have this sort of criticism against maybe that particular wife. I know that even to that wife, if I were sitting down here talking to her, I would be gentle and I would say, I understand your hurt, I understand your pain, and I am going to come in assuming that there's things that I'm missing from your perspective that you'd want to tell me about your husband. So please, I would say the same thing to you if you're a wife listening to this. Now, let's just get on the same page. What is the standard approach to boundaries when it comes to a marriage relationship? Now, there's a lot that's been written about boundaries. Really, the topic gained modern sort of popularity in the 80s, derived out of Alcoholics Anonymous, from what I understand. So it was originally meant to be used in the context of your spouse is an addict and you are the sort of the victim or the collateral damage to their addiction. How do you keep yourself safe in those situations? So that's the origins. I think some of that makes sense about sort of how severe things go with boundaries because they're dealing with these really intense situations is sort of where the roots of a lot of these teachings come from. But the simple version of how boundaries are taught, the sort of standard model for boundaries is a property line enforced by a consequence, triggered by how you feel, and oftentimes taught as something that you set, but not so much effort is spent teaching you how to lift that boundary. And that's going to be another thing that we get to. So let's sort of break this down. A boundary is a property line. This goes back to the Boundaries book by Cloud and Townsend, where they sort of articulate boundaries in this way. And the imagery here, of course, is like actual land property, like real estate. It's meant to give you this visual of sort of two neighboring houses, and your boundary is around your property line. It's where you end and she begins. So your feelings, your body, your time, your choices all sit inside your fence, and then all of her stuff goes inside hers. And the gist is, hey, you're responsible for what goes on in your fence. Now, this again, this is not this in and of itself, I think, is totally fine. You are responsible for the things that you can control. You're ultimately responsible for yourself. You are ultimately can't be responsible for your wife. She is her own person. Okay, so far so good. Maybe one small criticism would be that right off the bat, we are approaching boundaries as an instrument of separation, an instrument of extrication from each other, an instrument of pulling each other apart and separating your lives from each other. Now, the second problem here with boundaries is that the trigger is a feeling. The way when if you ask yourself, okay, well, Mr. Author or Mrs. Author, how do I know when I need a boundary? The answer you're going to get back is, in short, when you feel like it. And this really is, I think, where so much of the problem of application comes in, because you will have authors that really are giving their readership the benefit of the doubt. And yet when your readership is people, or even maybe particularly because you're writing to hurting wives, or you're writing to people who are in a difficult marriage at all, wife or husband. If we say to those people, the time when you need a boundary is if you're hurting. Do you have hurt feelings? You need a boundary. I mean, you don't need me to explain the problems with that. You don't need me to explain to you, right? Because you have a brain and a few brain cells in it, that you can understand how it would be so easy to take false license to use a boundary. A boundary is a sledgehammer tool, it is a bust it up type tool. If you take out a boundary for a problem that really just needs a scalpel, well, guess what? You've caused a lot of collateral damage on your relationship, and maybe needlessly so. So this is the problem. The reader is left to just figure it out for themselves in the specifics. You're just told, you know when you need it. Do you feel disrespected? Do you feel resentful? Do you find yourself feeling the same sort of hurt over and over and over again? Okay, well, that's like an alarm bell in your mind. And if you have that same feeling over and over again, then guess what? You need a boundary. But you'll remember to one of the episodes in that coaching learning series that we did. I tell you what, I'm just going to go find it right now. Okay, yeah. It was episode 27. It's called You've Been Lied to About Your Marriage Problems. And the argument that I make in that episode is basically why you should expect your marriage to have the same problems over and over again. I'm not going to remake that whole argument here, but the gist is having the same problem over and over again, in some sense, is just proof of personality differences, not proof of an unsalvageable marriage relationship. Personality differences, maybe narrative entrenchment as well. But certainly what it's not proof of is just in and of itself, if the same problem happens over and over again, we need a boundary. But that's so often how it's taught. And then when we come to the actual mechanism, like what is the boundary? The boundary is a limit plus a consequence. Okay. And so you name the limit and you attach the consequence. The consequence is supposed to be what makes it real. And you'll hear stuff like a boundary without a consequence is just a suggestion. And, I think to myself, well, but hold on. Hold on. Consequences are about the other person. If I'm giving you a consequence, it's because I'm trying to teach you something. I am trying to make you learn, make you change. But at the start, we talked about property lines. We talked about you're responsible for what happens inside your fence. So already we're starting to see some of the tension in how this is taught. You can't make sense of this because it's contradictory. You can't be told to give a consequence, go over there and mess up your neighbor's bushes, go mess up their driveway, go mess up their house, kick the door open so that they get the message. That's a consequence. But you're just responsible for what goes on inside your property. So, okay, there's some tension there. And again, the way that we're even measuring our boundaries is by the size of the consequence. It's a big boundary if it's a big consequence. You need a big boundary. You got big feelings, you need a big consequence to go with it. You perceive big misbehaviors, you need a big consequence to go with it. That way they get the message, they get the picture. And it puts the person who's enforcing the boundaries in this position of, have I given them enough consequence to where they've gotten it yet? And it puts you in this power dynamic, this sort of hierarchical dynamic that I don't think helps us get back to connection. Well, again, I think that this is because we're sort of trying to get, we don't have a good goal for what the boundary is actually supposed to do. And oftentimes we don't actually even talk about what change, like what does a successful boundary look like? We kind of skip that part. We rush through that part. Really, a lot of the time about boundaries is spent talking about how much you deserve to have one, how much you need to keep it even when your spouse objects, and how to actually sometimes enforce it in the first place. But a lot of times you might not even get that far. But one of the unifying themes through it all is that boundaries are pointed out of the marriage. And this, again, was sort of one of my major critiques overall, is that the escalation of the boundaries is always progressively out of the relationship. Every escalation is a step towards less contact. And there's not a clear difference between boundaries and ultimatums, and they get blurred together. And some people will honestly purposely blur them together. And it is just so rare to find anybody talking about boundaries that you don't just get the sense they are almost celebratory when those boundaries result in divorce. It's like, oh, good job. You set those boundaries down and your marriage broke apart and you finally escaped that really bad situation. Hooray. And sometimes I guess perhaps there's situations that are appropriate. But again, I'm just going to tell you, it sets up marriages for failure because one of the tools that's meant to protect the marriage is actually always and consistently used to bring it to its end. And because even when you don't frame it as like the or else is divorce, even when it's not framed that way, because it's so often taught as like, well, if you're ready to set a boundary, you need to start thinking about divorce. You need to start thinking about how much of this you can tolerate and like where your limit is, right? Where is that property line at? The pull, the gravity of the boundary is away from the marriage. And again, if you're a guy listening to this, you don't need me to tell you that most of the time, this boundary material is written to a wife about you, about the husband. And you'll even have some authors out there who will just straight out say that. Like, yes, I am writing only to women. And if you're a man, like, figure it out. Like some of this stuff applies, but, women really need this. Women need boundaries more than men. And so that's why I need to write to women. Women are the ones that are stuck in these unhappy marriages. So that's why I need to write to women. Women are the ones that need boundaries to protect themselves from these men who are completely recklessly breaching boundaries and falling into unsafe behavior just time after time. And again, that's just kind of the underlying tone of so much of the teaching about boundaries. And again, as I said earlier, the final sort of critique is like so much of the effort and the energy goes into setting the boundary, not lifting the boundary. And there is that version out there. And like, especially if you start going on a social media, you go onto Facebook, you go onto TikTok, you get out of some of the actual therapists or some of the well-meaning Christian authors, and you will get into the sort of divorce coach side of TikTok or pick whatever social media platform where the way boundaries are taught are much harsher and much more reckless and much more intense. And the on-ramp is much shorter because it's just like really every single one of these criticisms that I've levied gets taken to 10, right? It's like the line into the boundary is even blurrier. The intensity of the boundary is even higher. The readiness for divorce is even further. And that's just sort of the extreme end. That's sort of the pop culture version of boundaries in this day and age. But what I want to come to as we sort of draw to a close of this episode is I want to summarize what are the problems, if we just can sort of break it down, a few clean problems that we are going to look to fix and address in the next episode when we come back to what should a boundary do? How do you actually do it? Well, the problems in how boundaries are taught from where I'm sitting. And again, please remember, guys, I am like just a guy on the internet here. I am not the counselor. I don't have a bunch of letters after my name. I'm just somebody who's seen inside a lot. I'm talking thousands of separations over the years. Okay. Now, granted, I've seen that from the male side. I've seen it from the husband side. I've worked with a few women over the years, but really like 99%, it's separated husbands who want to save their marriage. That's who I'm working with. Okay. All the same, I, of course, am a married man, so I have some other additional vested say in this as well, of course. But here's where boundaries break down and how they're taught, I think, across the board. And this, I think, is true generally, even of like the best, most fair, rigorous material out there is we don't have a very clear trigger. The boundary tilts towards the exit of the relationship. Even if it's not taught this way, it becomes leverage. And all of these things contribute to a sort of muddiness around boundaries that makes it very easy for the less informed and less charitable and less good faith actors, sort of the more bad faith actors, to take these concepts and really turn them into inflammatory, destructive teachings about how to apply boundaries to your relationship. So we can sort of, from that, invert what do we want a boundary to do? Well, we want boundaries, ideally, like if we could just, let's set aside how do we actually do this, but if we could just wave a magic wand and say, well, what do we want boundaries to do for a marriage? Well, we want boundaries to be able to be done from a posture of leaning in. We want boundaries that remain tilted towards the marriage, not towards divorce. Because otherwise, what's the point of having a boundary if we're already at the point where we're accepting divorce by the time we institute the boundary? No, we want boundaries that tilt towards the marriage. And hand in hand with that, we want boundaries that are done in earnest for the relationship. I'm all on board with focus on what you can control. So I don't mind sort of thinking about property lines here and property lines over there with what's her stuff. But the boundary shouldn't be done to divide our property lines apart. It should be to find safety for our property lines to be neighboring to each other. We want to do boundaries in earnest for the good of the relationship. I'm going to talk more about that next time, why I do think you should and can view boundaries in that way. We want to do boundaries in a way that's empathetic to your spouse. We don't want your spouse to experience what my client from the start of this episode experienced, where, like, because the boundaries that he was living under were actually unfalsifiable, they you if he leaned in and tried to, like, be kind, that was perceived as, like, controlling narcissism. If he didn't lean in and gave her space, that was perceived as, like, avoidant stonewalling, and so it was unfalsifiable. There was no way out from under the boundary because, again, the condition he was under the boundary for is, "Do my feelings still hurt? Yes, then therefore I must still need a boundary." So we want boundaries that are empathetic to your spouse, that are fair to your spouse. And here's the most important part: we want boundaries to be clearly defined and clearly and fairly scaled to the size of the hurt that they are responding to. Now, I know that we didn't cover exactly how to do that in this episode. Next episode is when I'm going to give you the actual framework. I'll give you the teaser. There's two words that I think really go so far with understanding and applying boundaries in your relationship. And I'll give you a test for how to tell whether you actually even need a boundary in the first place. Two more words there that I think help with that. So listen, if you guys did get something out of this episode, the best thing that I would recommend you to do is just come back and listen to the next one. But I do have a cheat sheet for this episode on the site. It's husbandhelphaven.com/episode 38. URL for that should be on the screen right now, but it's husbandhelphaven.com/episode dash the numbers 38. And the only other thing I will say is that if you are in Husband Help Group, you actually already have access to this entire teaching, because I did a 4-part series on communicating for connection back in December of last year at the start of Husband Help Group when we first opened doors to that. And so just when you sign up, go check out those group teachings. I do a free teaching for the entire group every month based on what the group wants me to teach about. And so that's the ones from December. You can go skip ahead and sort of get the answer there if you wish. But either way, I'm going to be back next week. This is a really important topic. I want to talk about it. I want this just to be out there in the public for anybody to listen to and learn from. So that's exactly what we're going to do in the next episode. I'll look forward to going through it with you. I hope that this episode got you thinking. And no matter which side of this issue you're on, whether you're the person who thinks you need the boundaries, or you're the person who's suffering, or who's like, the boundaries have been enacted against you, I hope that this is either validating or informative or thought-provoking, or perhaps all three, as you are working around and trying to figure out how to work with and within boundaries in your marriage. Again, please hear me, and hopefully you can get on board with this. Boundaries can be good for your marriage. We want them to be good for your marriage. I purposely didn't throw stones at any particular person in this episode. So again, if you're like another influencer or teacher out there listening to this, I'm trying to stay kind, trying to stay gentle. One way or another, guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope this episode gave you something to think about. And we will see you in the next one, where we will finish out how to actually use boundaries to build up your marriage. Looking forward to it. Much manly love, guys. See you on the next one.